Collectors see rare things and want rare things. In the real world, this might be some old coins that the Romans dropped, or some stamps or something, but who cares about any of that? No, we're interested in virtual block game items, some of which might be different colours. While this video isn't entirely about coloured armour, they're by far the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about Skyblock collectors. So we'll start with them. Exotics. In HypixelSkyblock, there are hundreds of armour sets, each with their own unique design. When you look at someone's armour, you can immediately tell what set it is. That means that owning an expensive armour set is a huge flex, since everyone can immediately see what set it is and how rich you must be. Now, thinking back to vanilla Minecraft, you know that diamond armour is blue, and that gold armour is, well, gold. So how can Hypixel make their sets new colours? Well, most sets of armour in HypixelSkyblock are actually made out of leather, which can be dyed in vanilla Minecraft to one of 4.2 million different colours by combining different dyes with the armour in a crafting table. But if you just change the item's data rather than crafting it, you unlock 16.7 million different colour values that leather armour can be. And that's how HypixelSkyblock made their armour different colours. Except there was a teensy little bug. One of them is that subscribe button still being red, so subscribe to be under 20k in our race to become the #1 Thomas on YouTube. But the second is that players could actually put any rare piece of Skyblock armour into a crafting table and dye it to any colour they wanted. Players didn't really know this was a bug, and if you dyed your armour, it was no longer recognisable as the expensive set it once was, so it actually reduced the value, since dyeing it back was hard or sometimes impossible due to the 4.2 million colour crafting limit. This resulted in not many players dyeing their armour, as it seemed to just be throwing away money by reducing the resale price and making you look dumb. In fact, less than 6% of all armour was dyed, but even if you wanted more, you could just make more, right? November 18th, 2019. Nitroholic just released a tiny, small, unimportant patch. Romero now accepts any tier of flower minion. The quiver arrow reappears a bit faster, and oh yeah, armour can no longer be dyed. If you know anything about the concept of supply and demand, you know that with a stable demand, if you lower the supply, you increase the price. And that supply just stopped increasing. In fact, it started decreasing. This led to these dyed armor pieces earning a new name, exotics. You see, even though you can't make new exotics anymore, doesn't mean that all the old ones are going to stay around. People stop playing, sometimes craft armor into new sets, do void challenges, or get wiped. And Skyblock players love to get wiped. Normally, items being lost isn't a huge issue, but when the item is rare or can't be obtained anymore, it starts to really matter. Plus, that 6% number comes at a time when Skyblock was brand new, and there were much fewer players and much less armour being created. From the data we can measure, before this bug was patched, players crafted around 1.3 million armour pieces that could have been dyed. Of those, less than 100,000 of those were made into exotics. Today though, just counting the pieces which have exotic counterparts, there are over 23 million armour pieces, yet the number of exotics has stayed the same. Since exotics were getting rarer and rarer, collectors started wanting more and more of these exotics, eventually leading to a Discord community being created for these collectors, known as the Exotic Cafe, founded on the 25th of August, 2020. The first scanners. Collectors need a way to collect these items. Just like in real life, you can't find every single comic book from all time just listed on eBay. No, they're quite hard to come by, and so were these exotics. You see, players liked wearing their armour, and lots of players didn't know what exotics even were, never mind that people were willing to pay for it. As a collector, you could try just looking at players in hubs, or making advertisements in Discord servers. But that required that the players were wearing the exotic armour, or that they knew what you were even looking to buy. No, they needed a better way, and luckily, there was one. Hypixel provides an API, which is basically just a specific set of websites that you, or a program, can visit to find out information about certain things in the game. Notably, they had an API to view all of a player's profile data, including their inventory, armor, wardrobe, and more. That means that if you just had the name of a player, you can find out if they have any exotics. Since it returned all of their profile data though, you could find out if any of their co-op members had exotics too. The first scanners pretty much did this. When you joined any public Skyblock island, it would make an API request for each player in your server to find out what items they had, and if any of them were exotics. These were mostly private or paid for mods, limiting the technology to just a few collectors, unless you were willing to pay out cold, hard, real-world cash for them. There was also another limitation to these mods. It assumed that anyone with exotics would be hanging around in a hub for you to find. The more time that passed since the patch though, the less likely that any given player who was playing pre-patch would just be there. Lots of players quit, became slightly less active, or just don't happen to be online in that specific hub when you joined it. This was slightly improved upon by checking the auction house for any exotics that someone had put up for sale, but that, again, was limited to only those players who happened to sell these items. There had to be a better way. Databases. Some players figured out how to make scanners not just for the people in their lobby, but for thousands of players instead. While you could check the co-op members of their co-op members, not everyone is in lots of co-op since that's a huge commitment, so you'd mostly only find their closest friends that way. Wait, closest friends? See, the Hypixel API had another trick up its sleeve. You could request a list of all of a player's friends. From making a request for one player, you then had a list of dozens, possibly hundreds more, just from their friends list. Then, as you scanned each friend, you could also find their friends, exponentially increasing the number of players you knew about. With this method, you could theoretically find almost every player on Hypixel, and with it, all the accessible exotics. This was the solution, right? Well, yes and no. See, there's one key limitation with the Hypixel API that I haven't really mentioned yet. There is a hard limit of 120 requests per minute, so that means if you want to scan 240 players' inventories and view their friends list, that's 2 requests per player, so you can only scan 60 players per minute. Scanning 240 players would take 4 minutes, and that's that. Plus, players can choose to turn on and off viewing their stats over the API at will, at any time. While most players do leave it turned on so that they can use Discord bots and other services that need it, some leave it turned off for the majority of the time until something inconveniences them enough to turn it back on. In addition, players trade items all the time. Just because an item belonged to Adam 3 weeks ago doesn't mean it still does. He might have given it away to Steve in the meantime. Despite these limitations, these databases were by far the best way to find exotics, but they weren't public either. So if you weren't one of their friends, found a leak, or were willing to shell out, you had no chance. Until August 1st, 2021. A YouTuber by the name of A YouTuber who will not be named, alongside Ryan H. Code and Sad, have built and launched a mod set to revolutionize finding exotics forever. Its name is Tropical, and it is simply a lobby scanner, like before, except it's free, and it uploads all scanned players to a single database, so that players can search for exotics through a website rather than needing to lobby hop. This also means that players in lobbies are updated much faster in the database, as it is not just one developer's API key, but all of the users of the mod. It still had a few drawbacks, namely that it only scanned players in lobbies, unlike some of the databases that scan through friends lists. It was also a little slow, taking 500 milliseconds per player as it had no support for burst requests or rate limit variations. But it was still by far the biggest step forward in scanning technology and for all exotics, and a great resource for all the players who didn't have a scanner before. At least for the next 4 months, until the YouTuber was exposed for countless terrible things, stopped making videos, and withdrew his funding from the project. The website went down, as did the Discord bot, and the mod's users had to resort to using an older version, one that didn't use or upload anything to the website, and simply worked as another lobby scanner. As fate would have it, 3 months later, a new developer is on the scene, and they're about to change everything. That developer was me. January 13th, 2022. While chatting in the Discord server of another mod I made, TFM, I pitched a new mod idea to my users. Should I make an exotics finding mod? From that tiny spark, the plan grew. It would be like the databases people have, but crowdsourced from mod users. At this point, I was completely unaware that Tropical had recently attempted to do a very similar thing, and approached the problem from a new, unique, unbiased angle. You see, in computer science, there is a concept called distributed computing. Essentially, you take a bunch of computers and give them a small piece of a really huge puzzle, and they all solve it in parallel to produce a solution much faster than any individual computer could have. This is normally used for things like predicting the weather or folding proteins, but I wanted to use it for finding exotics. There's a program in the medical world called Folding at Home, where millions of volunteers donate computing power to simulate protein dynamics, helping scientists to do really cool things like curing cancer and stuff. Instead of donating their computing power though, I wanted the users of my mod to donate something much less power hungry, their Hypixel API requests. Here is my simple first outline of how the mod would work. If that, surprisingly, wasn't clear enough for you, let me recreate it really quick. The client constantly talks to the server, receiving and processing jobs. A job is a player that needs to be scanned, whether it be someone in your lobby, someone from a friends list search, or just someone that hasn't been updated in weeks. The client takes this job and uses it to ask the Hypixel API for that player's items or friends list, whatever the job asks for, passes the result into a much less computationally intensive format, protobuf, and sends it back to the server. This way, the player's API key is never shared with the server, which meant both that the player kept their key safe and that the program didn't break Hypixel's API rules at the time. This meant that the server could prioritize which players got scanned at which time, based on their likelihood of playing Skyblock recently or at all, to keep the most up-to-date database with the fewest possible requests. Before I could get on with development though, I had to decide on a name. And after a ton of fantastic options, I went with the most sophisticated name I could come up with, the Exotics mod. I then spent the next few weeks developing and testing the mod in the backend, until, on the 2nd of February 2022, I released the first version to the beta testers. And it worked. Within just a day, we had over 500,000 players scanned, 4.7 million armor pieces, and almost 6 million new players queued. But wait, I thought I said before that there were under 100,000 exotics in the game. How did we scan almost 5 million armor pieces? Well, exotics aren't the only rare type of armor. There's also crystal, fairy, glitched, and spook dyed armor, obtained through various glitches that have since been patched.
Watch this. Oh my god. What the fuck?
Still worth quite a few coins. But I didn't stop at just scanning those. Instead, I saved every single armor piece, dyed or not, so I could make pretty graphs, get statistics, and future-proof against new changes by keeping as much data as possible. So why stop at armor? I wanted to track more, do more, be cooler. Okay, maybe not that last one. I wanted to track every single item in HypixelSkyblock. So, after some quick calculations, I estimated it could take up to 800 gigabytes of data to store it all. That's pretty much a full hard drive dedicated to just HypixelSkyblock items. Probably not too insane when you realize how big Skyblock is, but it was still 400 times more data than I was currently storing. So, by the 11th of February 2022, I upgraded my custom protocol to transmit the data as efficiently as possible, bought more servers, and spent hours and hours changing the mod to not just function with exotics, but any possible item data, which led to the mod's current name, ITEM. Still, all this data begs the question, why were people donating their API requests to begin with? To put it simply, to help themselves by helping each other. The database couldn't update, and was of no use to anyone if no one contributed to it. So to incentivize people using the mod and donating requests, I created contributions. Every time you wanted to do an advanced search across the entire database, it would cost you contributions. The more items that needed to be looked through to fulfill your search, the more contributions it would cost. For example, searching through all items of a given type to find a certain hex would cost 600 contributions, and you earned, roughly, 1 a second. Lobby scanning was also greatly upgraded. Instead of needing to wait for the Hypixel API to respond each lobby swap, ITEM acted as a gigantic cache instead, returning results instantly for all the players in your lobby as long as they had been scanned before, and they almost certainly had. This also took contributions, but on the scale of 100 per scan, since it just had to search those players' known items rather than the entire database. Pretty much, to benefit from ITEM, you had to donate, but then everyone else also benefits. It's like that saying, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Except instead of Karl Marx, it's me promoting Communism in Skyblock. Anyway, now that we had the biggest database in Skyblock history, it was time to start using it. February 15th, 2022. We own the biggest museum in HypixelSkyblock, so we get quite a few visitors coming to check it out. This time, it was none other than the retired admin PJoke1, who was admin for almost 3 years before retiring in March 2021. After capturing his Hypixel and having a friendly chat, I thought it's about time to test out my new tool to see what interesting items he has. Now, I was simply scrolling through his items data when I noticed some oddities that weren't typically present on the other items in my database. Most of this discovery could have been made through manual inspection, but with the ITM database, we had the power to confirm our suspicions, and found that the origin tags, item menu, and item command meant that an item was spawned in through either the admin-only item menu or given via a command respectively. And PJoke just so happened to have quite a few of these items, some of which also had illegal enchants that are unobtainable without admin permissions, so we discreetly asked if we could buy them from him, sneakily hiding the real reason we wanted them. At this point, we'd been chatting with him on our island for over 5 hours, but it was still a huge surprise when he instantly agreed and instead traded us the items for free, not accepting any payment for them. We immediately felt quite bad that we'd essentially scammed him out of these precious items, and since we'd added him on Discord a few hours before, invited him to hop into a call where we explained what was actually so special about the items, and also explained how the ITM project worked to him. Luckily, we didn't get wiped for lying to an admin, but instead he found it quite funny and clever, and that he didn't mind us keeping the items for display in the museum. We're still friends with him to this day, and quite frankly, don't deserve the kindness he treated us with, so a huge shout out to him. Dupe Checking. After discovering origin tags, I did a bunch more research the next day into what tags there were, their distribution throughout Skyblock, and what other cool insights we could learn from them. There was a bunch, and I eventually made a few spreadsheets showing a breakdown of how common each origin tag was, and the items that most commonly had each. However, most importantly, I found a method to dupe check. You see, a few months prior, on the 26th of January 2022, there was a small duplication glitch that was discovered in the Crystal Hollows. To put it simply, anytime you clicked on an item in a chest UI, it would put the item into your inventory. This led to players' inventories quickly filling up, and afterwards, when they clicked on any other item, it would go directly into their stash. In Skyblock, the stash is an often overlooked part of the game that holds items that were supposed to go straight into your inventory but failed for some reason. Normally, when an item that you get from legitimate gameplay went into your stash, it was first given an origin tag, which might be something like Fire Sale or Boss Drop, and then keeps that origin tag after you claimed it from your stash. However, most of the items acquired via this dupe didn't get an original origin tag, since you weren't meant to be able to dupe items in the first place, so instead they were given a generic item stash origin tag, representing that their origin was your stash. After finding out this information, we tested hundreds of different, legitimate ways to obtain items that might result in the item stash origin tag, and we found 2, collecting items from the experimentation table, and collecting items from a Crystal Hollows loot chest, both with a full inventory. Since there was a limited loot pool that could actually drop from the experimentation table, this gave us an easy blacklist of non-duped items, and we could flag with a high confidence that any other items with this origin tag were duped. I was then able to make this into a mod, and release the world's first generically applicable dupe checker that worked with any duped item, regardless of whether it had been auctioned or spotted with a duplicate UUID. This was greatly received, with thousands of players, many of whom hadn't heard of me or my mods before, using the mod to protect themselves from false wipes or blacklisted items. The Hasco situation. So, remember how we could use the database and origin tags to find out what items were admin spawned? Well, showing off my new powers, I sent some friends a list of all the admins who had spawned items in their inventory and how many of those they had. Someone pointed out to me that one of those admins was sus, because they actually played Skyblock legitimately. That admin was xHascoX, better known as Hasco. At the time, I was trying to get a job as a developer at Hypixel, and it was said that the best way to get an offer there was to get them to notice you building cool things in the community and they might reach out. Me being me, I definitely got myself noticed. I made a tweet in jest, poking fun at Hasco, with a little winky face saying, "Don't you play legit?" before breaking down the numbers into a list of items and a graph to show off this cool data, and oh boy, I was not prepared for the consequences of my actions. The post garnered thousands of views and 200 likes, and even elicited a joking response from Hasco himself saying, "I'm innocent, I swear." I was clear in the original post that I wasn't accusing Hasco of abuse or lying, since he's an admin and needs to do that for his job, but that part wasn't as clear, nor was it the takeaway that a casual viewer would remember, and lots of people called me out in the community for publicly shaming Hasco, while others started accusing Hasco of admin abuse. While this was a very important lesson for me to learn, it was a huge reaction that I was completely unprepared for, and made me realise I had to be much more careful with my words. Well, until the very next day, when the admins removed origin tags from all items created from that day onwards. This made my heart drop, since the community had lost a really cool, interesting statistical tool overnight because of one silly tweet I made, and I thought back and realised that the consequences for my actions were much larger than I expected. The admin said that it was never intended for players to see, and that it was removed intentionally. Over the next few days, I drafted up a suggestion to post on the Hypixel forums, justifying the existence of the origin tags, and asking nicely that the admins brought it back. In hindsight, this achieved nothing but drawing more attention to the original tweet, and led to even more players realising I was likely the reason that origin tags were removed, all for a dumb tweet. Eventually, I actually met Hasco in real life and got to apologise in person, but still, the whole situation did not go over well, and it was the first time that I had to think about how such a tool could actually be a bad thing for the Skyblock community. I was determined to make it right. While I was still campaigning for the return of origin tags, I had a chat with the MGRF in the Cowshed Discord server. I provided one of our use cases for origin tags, explaining how they were used to identify duped items from the Crystal Hollows update. He replied with this message, stating that it was an extremely subpar method of checking for dupes, and that UUIDs are much better. While he was 100% correct about both points, it was the only method that players had, since checking UUIDs against the whole server was impossible without knowing every UUID on the server. He told me that that was the admin's job. I wasn't satisfied with this reply though, as I knew that innocent players had been wiped due to accidentally buying duped items on the auction house, which one player mentioned. This discussion ignited a spark in me. Little did he know, but I was already attempting to build a database of every item on the server, and over the next couple weeks, I built my own UUID-based dupe checker, the best ever created. and the only dupe checker to this date that can truly advertise a 0% false positive rate. It did this by finding the last 5 stored previous owners of a given item in ITM's database, and checking their inventories in real time with the Hypixel API to see whether they still had the item. If multiple players had the item with a given UUID, then it is indisputably 100% duplicated. Of course, the mod couldn't boast a 0% false negative rate, as some players still had API off or stored the items in a chest, but it was better to be on the safe side. It was much better to have a 0% false positive rate, meaning that items that weren't duped definitely didn't flag as duped and damage the economy. After the creation of this dupe checker and its rising popularity, I went to Hypixel to ask for an increased key limit for the dupe checking itself, so that I could support the increased load from its popularity by scanning the players that actually needed to be scanned in real time, to ensure they hadn't just traded it to another player, but actually simultaneously own the item. I received a far from positive response to this, with no explanation as to why after explaining that the implementation satisfied all their policies and caching guidelines. Defeated, I accepted this answer for a while, until my user base increased significantly again, and this time I received a much clearer response, which explained that the dupe checker could never work properly, and that they don't want to support any use case where their database gets scraped. Even though this would not be scraping their database, and simply looking up inventories of a few previous owners per query, I understood this as it was directly linked to the main ITEM project, which did in fact scrape their database. In fact, this is the first moment that I realized that Hypixel might not actually like what I was doing, even though I felt it was for the good of all players at the time. I resorted to allowing players to dupe check using their own API key in the mod, but rather than being like the website, which restricted them to a single item, they could check all of a player's items, which reduced the load of my website enough for it to continue operating. The museum. No, this isn't about our island, although if you do want to check that out, /visit TGWaffles, but rather about the built-in museum added on November 2nd, 2021. It has a bunch of cool functionality, mainly allowing you to showcase items, unlocking other parts of the game, and upgrading your bank. But there's one part that really stuck out to me since the beginning. There's this super cool number that shows above an item or armor set, bragging about how early your item was created. Maybe you know where this is going? Well, actually I lied a little. It is a bit about our island. See, our island was first and foremost a place to store and display captured cake souls, which are sentimental items representing a specific person in-game. Our collection was gigantic, and we were continuously expanding it through donations and buying up cake souls that we cared about. It was fantastic, and the whole reason behind my co-op's Discord name, Cake Soul Club. Until the 2nd of June, 2022. They soulbound all captured cake souls. This completely discombobulated us, and it felt like our entire purpose had been ripped from us. All of the cake souls in the museum were now worth a whopping 0 coins, and our museum could never be complete, as many cake souls, such as helper and mod souls, were now unobtainable forever, as the ranks didn't exist anymore. Trading for some of these rare souls was impossible, and it left us not knowing where to take the museum from here. The next day, I had an idea. I have a database of almost every item in the game. There's a cool thing we could do. Collect the first ever created items. How is the database relevant, you may add? Normally, you'd have no idea whether an item was the first created or the 1500th, at least until you put it in the museum and found out. Except, when you put it in the museum, it soulbinds it, preventing you from selling or trading the item ever again, even if it's not the first. But with ITEM, we could actually check to see if an item was one of the first of its kind created, given a little bit of leeway, since some items might be in chests or held by people with API off, and offer to buy it from them for a much higher price than they get selling it normally. With this method, we managed to get the first ever created bedrock, artisanal shortbow, pumpkin launcher, magma bow, sculptor's axe, rookie hoe, bonzo head, voidwalker katana, and atom split katana. There were a few others that were close, but missed by a few, and one really annoying armor set. There's a pair of creators named 15 Ancient Yarns, and they quite famously earned the first wither set in the game, except on the 8th of June 2022, they were wiped, and that set stopped existing. So in theory, if I could get a set that beat the second created set, it should now show us first in the museum, because it would be the first created item that still exists, right? So we checked out the second place's set, Refractions, and we did in fact find pieces that were eligible and could beat his, and some could even beat 15H's, but the museum takes the latest date from all the pieces, so if even one set was later than Refractions, it would show third. Well, until we realized something. Why does Refraction set still show second if 15H's doesn't exist anymore? And so we tested with some other items that we knew had been wiped, and sure enough, the museum acted as if they still existed, and our plan was foiled. We did get some cool pieces out of it though, but thankfully we never went ahead with the chestplate since that would have been expensive. Oh, and one other thing, we have a boomerang that was created months before Dungeons released. Good luck beating that. The other collectors. Up until this point, I've talked mostly about what I personally used the ITM database to accomplish. However, as it was not a private resource, thousands of other people used it too, in their own ways. I asked a couple of the most successful users for an interview. One of these users goes by the username Graphical. Do you remember how you first found out about ITM?
I remember being interested in people who wore exotics in the hub. Then I asked one of them how I can find my own, and they sent me a link to your server, in early June 2022 if I recall correctly.
Do you remember your first experience or snipe using ITM? Can you tell me what happened?
At first, when using ITEM, I mainly hub sniped, and I think my first ever snipe was a white obsidian chestplate I found in a hub.
How much did you pay for it, and how much was it worth?
I think I got it for free, and ended up selling it for around 20 million. Worth like 150 million now, I guess. The hex was FBE4ED, by the way. I somehow still remember that, even though I almost instantly sold it.
How much do you think you've made in total from ITM?
Probably between 200 and 250 billion, if we're counting the value at the time of the snipe.
How much would that have been in today's money with inflation?
It's hard to estimate, but maybe 500 billion, if not more.
That's insane. Do you have a favorite piece or set that you got?
I would say there can be many favorites, but I would say that my favorite and my most valuable at the same time was a same Hex Red Superior set snipe that I made in 2023. I paid 0 coins as the player didn't even own the set and did not care for it, and I have never sold it, but it is worth at least 60 to 70 billion coins. It could likely sell for higher. Oh, I just made a good snipe while we were doing this interview, lol.
What did you get?
A sort of light bluey mint fade farm suit. I paid 250 mil, but that's far under its value.
Have you ever lost money on a snipe?
In the early days of my sniping, I had a hard time distinguishing crystals and exotic hexes, so I ended up paying around 50 mil for a crystal dyed superior set, which was worth like 30 mil at the time. Other than that, no.
Can you explain really quick to the viewers what a snipe is, and how a typical snipe would actually play out?
Well, basically, sniping is where you find a player with exotics and offer them an amount lower than the actual value for their exotics. Most people don't even know what exotics are, so they think they're getting a good deal and accept it. For me though, I use a method that usually makes them give it to me for free, since I mainly snipe players who haven't played in forever.
And one last question, because I'm sure people will be dying to know. Skyhelper only shows your net worth on your main profile as 26 billion coins. Can you explain why the bot isn't accounting for the other 200 or 250 billion coins?
Well, to be honest, with inflation, my net worth is probably more like 300 to 400 billion, but that's besides the point. Exotics cannot be measured with a bot as the price is subjective, and making a bot that can accurately keep track of exotic prices would be almost impossible.
Sniping. That's the moral dilemma behind almost all exotic collectors. This whole time, when I've said that people scan exotics to collect them, the collection there is buying armor from players that don't know the value to get a better deal for themselves. The issue is, it doesn't just end there. Since most of these pieces were created in 2019, a lot of these players don't play anymore. So how can you make an offer to these players if you never see them online or in hubs? Well, that's the second issue. You see, exotic collectors don't just sit around in hubs anymore waiting for an actual Skyblock player to join. No, one strategy that they use is setting up notifiers that continuously ping the Hypixel API to tell them when a player with the items they want logs in, and immediately spam partying and messaging them about their Skyblock armor until they give in, sometimes in a nefarious way. Now, no hate to Graphical, as I'm not saying he does this, but I've seen many collectors engage in these behaviors, much to the detriment of their reputation. In fact, that's why the name Exotic Collector leaves such a bad taste in people's mouths in the Hypixel community nowadays. It reminds them of players who harass them until they get what they want, often ripping you off in the process and disappearing with the profits, never to be seen again. And that would be bad enough, but it stems even outside of Hypixel. There's a feature on Hypixel to link your Discord account to your in-game account, which is often used to authenticate with Discord bots to prove that you own the Minecraft account like you say you do. However, collectors have started using these to find the Discord accounts associated with players that have rare exotics, so that they can add them on Discord to try and convince them to part ways with their armor there too. At first, I thought these were smart ways to get items that had once been lost to the sands of time back into the economy, trading around again. So much so that I actually developed a notifier myself called Go Scan Players that would allow you to ping a Discord webhook when a player on your list logged in. But as I've seen undiscovered exotics get rarer and collectors get more desperate, I struggle to justify this behavior, and I have since stopped developing that notifier, not pushing a single update since May 2022. The slow death of ITEM. I could never stop thinking about the response to my support ticket from 2022. We don't plan on supporting use cases where our database gets scraped. Eventually, it made me realize that Hypixel will never be a fan of ITM. And even if it wasn't technically against the rules, it still felt like I was bending them and working against Hypixel. But they had the power to shut the project down, and if they simply reached out to me and asked me to stop what I was doing, I would have. So I kept it up and running, paying the server cost out of my own pocket, in the hopes that in the future I could make the money back in some way, through some payoff. February 7th, 2023. Connor Linfoot, a network developer at Hypixel well known for working on the API, made a new post titled Public API Changes, February 2023. In it, he quoted a ton of impressive statistics, finally stating that the public API is their highest scale service in the network. In other words, it's expensive. In the post, he states that they will be removing player-based API keys and requiring each developer request an API key for each application, meaning that mods can no longer rely on the player's API key and have to make a request to a private backend if they want to get Hypixel API data. In the post, he makes the following statement. One big pitfall of the public API is the ease that players can create API keys. This leads to abuse that can be intentional or accidental due to the way some client modifications work. Because of the ease of these keys, they are often also stolen from compromised accounts, or sometimes even borrowed from players without their consent, through mods that share the keys with the mob developers. While ITM did not steal keys from compromised accounts, and clearly asked for consent from the users as the entire premise was to contribute your requests, the last statement very clearly applies to what I was doing. We've also seen some mods act as a botnet, where they can request any data they want via the players with these mods installed. While we do not believe most of these mods were doing it with malicious goals, and were only intending to provide functional and accessible features, these actions ended up severely overloading the API in a negative way. They were clearly making this change to address mods like mine, and to reduce their overall stress. And I completely understand it. With the API structured how it is, and their caching system working as you'd imagine, requests from a mod like ITM could definitely cause issues. While the mod was only making between 1200 and 2400 requests per minute, the equivalent of 10 to 20 players, the composition of these requests being mostly less frequently requested players, to limit our requests by requesting the least recently scanned players, meant that it could definitely have a huge impact on their systems. With the new proposed system, ITM could not continue functioning as it currently did. I made a futile request for ITM to have its own application key, which was denied for the same reasons as before, and frankly I'm just glad it didn't result in an API ban, as the main issues behind any load that ITM was providing were unneeded requests of less active players, or players that hadn't actually updated. I did spend a few weeks drafting a proposed addition to the Hypixel API, which would allow for not only projects like mine, but also leaderboards, progression tracking, archival, and other such uses to work with almost no additional load on their systems. And if you're interested in that, my co-op Ben Clark made a video covering it, but it was never implemented, likely partially due to the upfront development cost, but also as there weren't many examples of these applications that would use it, as they've been disallowed for years now. These decisions are something I will never truly know the full story behind, but I can respect them for making them, as they have a lot going on. The final nail in the coffin came when they finally updated the Hypixel API rules, stated that the API should not be used for automated data collection at scale, should not continuously pull player data, and that players must not share their API keys with a mod or proxy request for any third party, which would include ITM. As such, on the 14th of August 2023, when these changes came into effect, the ITM database stopped updating and remains forever frozen with only the data it had on that date. In total, I had spent over $1,500 on the servers from my own pocket up until that point, offering it as a free service for anyone in the community to use. As it had no future, the database is still online for players to make requests and download data from, so long as its users continue to donate enough to cover the server costs every month, by buying contributions that were earned for free from mod use before, to continue to make queries on the database, until all the data is far enough out of date to make it too useless for most people. So far, there has been around $0 of profit from this project, and my initial investment was never returned. But hey, it was fun while it lasted. In total, we collected 314 million unique items with UUIDs, 5.9 billion items without UUIDs, including stat items, 19.8 million pets with UUIDs, and 9.8 million without, after scanning 17.3 million players uncountable times, resulting in 25.8 million unique members on profiles. We miss you, ITM. Subscribe.